Hello, welcome back. Thank you so much for being here. Today, we're going to be going through my Huda beauty palettes, and I'm going to be letting you know if I would repurchase these again, knowing everything I know now. So I recently did this with my Pat McGrath Mothership palettes, and I've also done it with my Natasha Denona palettes. So today, I thought I would go through my Huda beauty palettes. So first up, I'm going to talk about these two palettes together is the new Huda Beauty Creamy Obsessions palettes. These have only been out for a couple of months and I don't particularly love them. So we have the Grayish Obsessions and we have the Neutral Brown Obsessions. Of the two palettes, I do prefer the Neutral Brown Obsessions. I just find that the shades give a little bit more pigmented. They're a little easier to work with. The Grayish Obsessions, I find they just sort of all melt into one another. I do think that these palettes are best for one or two shadow looks. These are not palettes that I think work very well if you're trying to make overly complicated looks. So that is something important to note, but otherwise I just don't love the creamy formulas in here. You don't get a ton of pigment, and even if you do, they just really don't last that long on the lids. I am someone who needs to prime my lids anyway because I have pretty oily eyelids, so I always have to set down a primer. But even when I do that and put one of these on, even if I am going for a simple one or two shadow look, these just do not wear all day for me. I just don't love them. I wanted to, I had really high hopes because I feel like I've had a very up and down experience with the Huda Beauty 9 pans over the years. The Brown Obsessions palettes, I decluttered one of those because I really didn't like it, but the last couple of years, I would say she's had some really good ones, so I started to kind of trust again that maybe I would like them, but these just weren't it for me. I'm sure there are some who love them, but for me, they're just not it. So I would not repurchase those. Next, I have the Cool Matte Obsessions palette, and so I believe she released these last year. There's the Cool Matte Obsessions and the Warm Matte Obsessions. I only picked up the Cool Mattes, and I love this palette. So this is, of course, an all matte palette. You do get two cream shadows in here, but I do think the cream shadows in here are much better than the ones in the Creamy Obsessions. And I do really love these mauve-y pink tones. I think they're so pretty and they're so easy to work with. Anytime I've created an all matte look with this palette, I just love how it turns out. I sometimes use this as an all matte palette and then pop on a pink shimmer, and I think that's beautiful also. I think this is a beautiful palette, and I do think she did a great job with this one. So this one I would purchase again if I had to. Next, and lastly for the 9 pans, I have the Love Fest Obsessions palette. So this one came out a few years ago. And this is an orangey purple color story. And on first glance, I don't know that I love this color story. I don't necessarily love the purples and oranges. I think they might be a little too aggressive, but the formula is actually so beautiful. I love that you get a mix of browns in here to kind of neutralize everything. The shimmers are stunning, and the looks that I've created with this one I've always really liked. That being said, I tend to forget that I have this. So while it's a good palette, it's forgettable. So for that reason, I would not repurchase this one again. I think it's really pretty and I think it's really great quality. And I think if you've had your eye on it, then I would recommend it, but I just forget about it. So I would not repurchase this one. Next, we have the oldest Huda Beauty palette in my collection, and this is the Mercury Retrograde palette. I feel like this one is such a classic. This will always be the prettiest spring color story. This will always be the palette that made me feel excited for color. I'm not a huge colorful eyeshadow wearer. I do prefer my neutrals, but if I'm ever looking for color and bright spring happy color stories, this is such a staple. I love this palette so much. I think it's so pretty. Unfortunately, I believe it's been discontinued, so you can't get it anymore. So I couldn't repurchase it even if I wanted to. But if it was available and I needed to repurchase it, I absolutely would because I think it's so fantastic. The formulas in her larger palettes are so much better than those in her 9 pans. They're completely different formulas. The larger palettes are made in Italy, the smaller ones are made in China. So there is very different formulas. different everything going on there, but the formulas in here are so good. I've often said that Huda is the queen of texture. She's not afraid to step outside the box and create different new textures that we might not be used to, and sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. But I do think she does a really great job, and this palette will forever be one of my favorite colorful favorites. I love to say that this palette is kind of the best colorful palette for neutral lovers. I love this palette. I think it's fantastic. If I could purchase it again, I would, but it's not available to repurchase anymore. Next, I have the Rose Quartz palette. This is another one. This one is quite well loved. I do love this palette. I love pinky purple tones. I love the way she's played with texture again. I love everything about this palette. This color story is just so pretty. It's got a mix of neutrals, well also these pinks and purples, but it's kind of on the lighter side, so I don't feel like it's intimidating. It's just very easy to work with and easy to wear. The only shade that I would never work with is this one right here in the middle. This one that kind of looks like a petri dish. She did this one in her Naughty Nude palette, which is one that I still have my eye on all these years later. I think this is a fantastic palette. It has been one of my favorite Huda palettes for a while. If I had to go back and choose knowing everything I know now, would I grab this? Probably. However, Alter Ego has a dupe for this palette. And Alter Ego does tend to have slight tonal differences to these shades, which is only natural. And they do rearrange the shades so that they're a little less chaotic and they make a little bit more sense, which I really like. And their price point is usually more than half of this. So I would probably not repurchase this because I know and actually have the Alter Ego dupe to this one. This is still one of my favorites from Huda, but I have the dupe, and if I had to repurchase this and I didn't have that one, I would probably just grab it because I want to save that cash. So as much as I love this one, I would not repurchase. And finally, we have the Pretty Grunge palette. This is a palette I did not expect to love because, like I said, it is called the Pretty Grunge palette. It looks really dark, really, really dark, but it's surprisingly wearable for a dark, grungy palette. Dark and grungy just isn't my makeup style whatsoever, but somehow this is so good. The formulas in here are amazing, but somehow this palette is incredible. First of all, the black background does make it seem a lot darker and grungier than it is, but I love how she's got these 6 very neutral shades right here. Then you have these more deeper gray tones. This shade here is very, very textured. This is a foiled shade, so you do want to warm it up between your fingers before applying it to the lid. But it does sort of mimic whatever you've got on underneath. It's got pink in there, it's got purple, it's got silver. This one is silver. This shade here is like purple and silver. And then you get a black up here. And then over here you get some pinky purple tones, and then you get a black eye gloss. I never use the black eye gloss. It just doesn't make sense for the eyes. But the rest of these shades are actually so beautiful and easy to work with. I have loved every look I create with this palette. The shade Stand Up right here is actually kind of like a very creamy shade. It's very interesting, but it's so beautiful. And even though this palette, because it is darker and grungier, I very much feel it more for fall. So it does feel out of season right now, but I've been thinking about it so much lately because I do love this palette. And this palette I absolutely would repurchase. I did not expect to like this one whatsoever, but I had the same thing with her Empowered palette. I didn't buy it because I did not think I would like it, and then I got the Alter Ego alternative, the Mirage palette, and I love it, and I really do love that color story. So I thought, my gosh, I don't want to miss out again. So when this came out, I thought, let's just grab it for a review, and I love the palette so much. So this one I 100% would repurchase. But that is it. So the one that surprised me was probably Rose Quartz because I do love this one, but like I said, I have the option to purchase an alternative for a much lower price point. But otherwise, I feel like if you're familiar with my channel, a lot of my answers were probably not surprising. Let me know down below if there are other groups of palettes, other makeup categories you'd like to see me do this sort of video with. Let me know. I just love hearing from you guys so much. If you're new here, I hope you'll consider subscribing before you go. I do upload new videos every single week. Thank you again so very much for watching, and I will see you in my next one. Bye!